Lecture 5. This was presented by Friedrich Nietzsche on March 23rd, 1872. Honored listeners, if what I have told you thus far of a philosopher's more or less violently agitated speeches delivered in the hush of night has been heard with any sympathy, then the ill-humored decision I described at the end of my last lecture must have struck you much as it did my friend and me. He suddenly announced that he wanted to leave. His friend had stood him up. What we and his companion could offer him in this wilderness instead was not particularly enlivening. Having stayed on the mountaintop longer than there was any reason to stay, he now wanted to leave quickly. He must have felt that the day was wasted. He no doubt wanted to put it behind him, casting off any memory of meeting us. And so, against our will, he insisted it was time to go, for us and for them, when something unexpected brought him to a standstill. His already upraised foot sank hesitantly back down to the ground. We saw a colored glow from the direction of the Rhine, heard a loud crackling noise that quickly died out, and then, from the distance, a slow, melodic phrase, sung in unison, many voices strong. "His signal," the philosopher cried. "My friend is coming after all. I have not waited in vain. It will be a midnight meeting. But how can I let him know that I'm still here? Come, marksman, now is the time to display your arts. Do you hear the strict rhythm of the melody that salutes us? Listen and repeat it with your gunshots." Now, this was a task to our taste and something we could actually do. We loaded as quickly as we could, conferred briefly, and raised our pistols toward the starlit peaks, while down in the valley, the penetrating series of notes echoed and died away. 1, 2, 3, our shots pierced the night, and then the philosopher shrieked, "Wrong rhythm!" For we had failed our task. A shooting star had hurtled down, quick as an arrow, after our third shot, and our fourth and fifth were fired at the same time, almost involuntarily in the direction of its fall. "Wrong rhythm," the philosopher shrieked. "Who told you to shoot at the falling star? It can fall perfectly well without you. If you're going to handle weapons, you need to know what you're doing." Just then, the melody from before rose up from the Rhine again, louder this time, intoned by more voices. "They understood anyway," my friend laughed. "And besides, who could hold his fire when such a bright apparition comes into range?" "Be quiet," the philosopher's companion interrupted. "What kind of mob is that, singing the signal?" 20 to 40 voices, I would guess. Strong male voices. And where are they singing from? They don't seem to have left the far bank of the Rhine, so we should be able to see them from our side. Come quickly. We have been walking on the plateau near the massive dead tree, and our view of the Rhine was blocked by a thick, tall, dark woods. As I have mentioned, though, we could see through the treetops from a quiet little clearing not far downhill. The Rhine, with the island of Nonnenfurt cradled in its arm, lay as if in an oval frame. We hurried eagerly, though, with all due consideration for the old philosopher, toward this quiet spot. It was pitch black in the woods, and leading the philosopher from either side, we could hardly see the trail, but somehow divined it. No sooner had we reached the benches in the clearing than we saw a large, dull, fiery, shifting glow, clearly from the other side of the Rhine. "Those are torches," I cried. "Surely those are my comrades from Bonn, and your friend must be in there with them. It is they who are accompanying your friend and who sang that song. Look, listen, they are getting into those boats now. The torchlight procession will arrive up here in barely half an hour. The philosopher leaped back. What are you saying? He burst out. Your comrades from Bonn? Students? My friend came here with students? This question, asked in something close to fury, angered us. What do you have against students? We countered, but we received no answer. Only after some time did the philosopher start to speak again, slowly and plaintively, as though to the one who had not yet arrived. So, my friend, even at midnight, even on this lonely mountain, we will not be alone. You are bringing a band of troublemaking students up here, though you know full well that I much prefer to avoid that genus omne. What do you mean by this, my distant friend? I do not understand. Our plans to meet again after so long apart, and here, in this remote place, at this unusual time, does that mean nothing to you? Why would we want a chorus of witnesses and such witnesses? No sentimental, soft-hearted need brings us together. We have both long since learned how to live alone, in dignified isolation. It was not for our own sakes that we described to meet here, not to nourish tender feelings or the like, not to stage a grandiloquent scene of friendship. No, here, where in a memorable hour I once met you in solemn solitude, we intended to give each other the most serious counsel, like knights of a new Vemic court. Let those who can understand us hear what we have to say. But why bring a mob of people who surely cannot understand us? It doesn't seem like you, my distant friend. It did not feel right to interrupt this bad-tempered complaint, and when the philosopher lapsed into gloomy silence, we did not have the courage to tell him how much his dismissive condemnation of students had naturally upset us. Finally, the philosopher's companion turned to him and said, I am reminded, teacher, that back before I knew you, you too lived at various universities. Tales of your teaching methods and interaction with the students are still going around. But from the resignation with which you spoke of students just now, one would think your experience there must have been strange and upsetting. I suspect that you saw and experienced what everyone sees and experiences there, and simply judged it more severely, and rightly so. I have learned this much from the time I have spent with you. The most remarkable, instructive, decisive experiences in life are the everyday ones. The enormous riddle before everyone's eyes is precisely what almost no one sees as such. These problems are left untouched, in the middle of the sidewalk, as it were, under the feet of the passing crowd, for the few true philosophers who carefully pick them up, hold them high, and make them shine as precious gems of wisdom. Perhaps in the time we have before your friend arrives, you can tell us a little about what you learned in the world of the university. That would bring our decision of current educational institutions and the observations we have unwillingly been forced to make full circle. Let me remind you that you promised to do this earlier this evening. You began by affirming the extraordinary importance of the gymnasium. Every other institution must be judged by its standard, however defined, and if the gymnasium goes astray, then every other institution will suffer alongside it. Universities then cannot claim to be the defining center of the system in the current model. At least from one important point of view, they are merely an extension of the gymnasium. You promised you would make this argument in detail later, as perhaps our student friends here might be able to attest, if they happen to hear that part of the conversation. Yes, we heard that, I said. The philosopher turned to us. Well, then, if you really were listening closely, why don't you tell me what you see as the mission of the gymnasium today, after everything I have said? Furthermore, you are still close enough to that realm to judge my thoughts on the basis of your own experience and impression. My friend, in his quick and nimble fashion, replied as follows. Up until now, we have always believed that the purpose of the gymnasium was to prepare students for the university. This preparation was meant to make us independent enough to enjoy the extraordinary freedom of university students. For no one in any sphere of life today is given as much freedom of choice and action as a student, it seemed to us. He has to be his own guide for several years, across a wide plain left entirely open to him. The gymnasium, then, is supposed to make him independent and self-sufficient. I continued my friend's speech. In fact, it seems to me that everything you criticize the gymnasium for, and I'm sure you're right, is needed to foster a kind of independence in students, or at least their belief that they are independent. That is the intended purpose of the German essays you're talking about earlier. The individual must learn to delight in having his own goals and views of his own, so that he can walk without crutches later. That is why he is encouraged to produce work so early, and criticism and sharp judgment still earlier. Even if Latin and Greek cannot inspire the student in a passion for distant antiquity, then at least the current method of instruction can awaken scholarly feelings, a desire for strictly casual knowledge, a passion to uncover and discover. How many students have been seduced once and for all, by the charm of academic scholarship because they founded the gymnasium a new way of reading and caught it in their own young fingers. The gymnasium student has to study all sorts of things, gather all kinds of knowledge, and this probably little by little creates in him a drive to study and gather in the same way at the university on his own. In other words, the mission of the gymnasium, in our view, is to prepare students to live and study independently, the same way they were forced to live and study under the gymnasium system. The philosopher laughed at us, but not entirely good-naturedly. And what a fine example of independence you are giving me here. Just the independence I find so shocking and which makes it so unpleasant to be around today's students. Yes, my good friends, you are prepared, you are mature, you are complete. Nature broke the mold after she made you, and your teachers have every right to rejoice in your existence. What freedom, certainly, and aplomb your judgments show. How new and fresh your insights are. You sit in judgments, and every culture of every age scatters before you. Your scholarly feelings are kindled, and fire shoots from your fingers. Look out, everyone. Make sure you don't get burned. And your professors, I see they are no less independent. They take independence to an even more forceful and charming level. Never was an era so rich in magnificent independences and never has slavery of any kind been so hated, including, of course, the slavery of education and culture. Permit me, though, to judge this independence of yours by that standard, the standard of true education and culture, and let us see how your universities measure up. When someone from abroad wants to learn more about our university system, his first pressing question is, how are your students connected to the university? We answer, through the ear. They take part in university life as listeners. The foreigner is amazed and asks, purely by listening? Purely by listening, we repeat. The student attends lectures insofar as he speaks or sees or walks or spends time in others' company or makes art. Insofar as he lives and breathes, in short, he is independent. That is to say, not dependent on the educational institution. Now, it very often happens that the student writes something down while he's listening. These are the moments when he is attached to the university by a kind of umbilical cord. He can choose what he wants to hear. He does not necessarily have to believe what he hears. He can shut his ears if he does not want to hear at all. This is the achromatic method of learning. The teacher then speaks to these listening students. Anything else he may think or do remains inaccessible to them, cut off by a monstrous chasm. He often reads while he speaks. In general, he wants as many listeners in attendance as possible. But if need be, he makes do with only a few, almost never with just one. One speaking mouth plus many ears and half as many writing hands, that is the academic system as seen from the outside, the educational mechanism of the university in action. And the possessor of this mouth is separated from and dependent of the possessors of those many ears. This double independence is glorified as academic freedom. To make for even greater freedom, the one can say whatever he wants, more or less, and the other can listen to whatever on offer he wants, more or less, except that in the background. A discrete distance away from both parties, the state stands watching with a certain supervisory look on its face, making sure to remind everybody from time to time that it is the aim, the purpose, the essence in this whole strange process of speaking and listening. We who must be permitted to regard this astonishing phenomenon solely as an educational institution will then inform the inquiring foreigner that what our universities call education and culture passes from mouth to ear, and that any instruction is merely, as I have said, achromatic. But since the listening, even the choice of what is to be listened to is a matter of the independent-minded student's personal judgment, and since this student can refuse to believe anything he hears, can deny it all authority, the educational process is, strictly speaking, left in the student's own hands. The independence that gymnasiums aspire to produce now struts about proud as can be, in its most brilliant plumage, presenting itself as independent higher education. Oh, happy age, when the young are wise and educated enough to teach themselves how to walk. Oh, incomparable gymnasiums, cultivating independence, while other eras believed in cultivating dependence, discipline, subordination, and obedience, resisting with all their might every delusion of independence. Now, my good friends, do you see why, from the standpoint of education, I regard today's universities as mere extensions of the gymnasium? The gymnasium education embodied in a young person strides through the university gates as something complete and whole, with its own ambitious claims. It makes demands, it legislates, it passes judgment. So do not fool yourself about the gymnasium graduate. Believing himself to have received the blessing of education, he remains a schoolboy shaped by his teacher's hands. In academic isolation, having left the gymnasium, he is now beyond the reach of any and every further process of formation and guidance. living from that point forward entirely free on his own. Free, put this freedom to the test, you connoisseur of human nature. A freedom built on crumbling foundations, the soft soil of today's gymnasium education. It stands crooked, vulnerable to the breath of the whirling tempest. Take a look at this free student, herald of independent higher education, and divine him from his instincts. Know him by his needs. What will you think of his education when you measure it by the following three yardsticks: his need for philosophy, his instinct for art, and finally the standard of Greek and Roman antiquity, the categorical imperative incarnate of all culture? We are so beset by serious and difficult problems that when brought to see them aright, we quickly acquire a lasting philosophical wonder. Only in this fertile soil can a deeper, nobler education grow. Most often, it is a person's own experience that brings him face to face with such problems, especially in tempestuous youth. Almost every personal incident shimmers in a double reflection, as an instance of everyday triviality, and at the same time as exemplifying an eternal, mysterious problem that cries out for an answer. At that age, when one sees one's experiences ringed around with metaphysical rainbows, as it were, one's need for a guiding hand is as its most urgent. A young person has suddenly and almost instinctively been convinced of a double meaning of existence, and also lost the firm footing of the beliefs and received opinions he once cherished. This great need for guidance is only natural, but clearly the beloved independence for which today's educated young person is groomed could not be more opposed to it. These young men of the modern era who have hopped into the lap of what is self-evident, are eager to suppress, indeed crush, this need, divert it, or deform it. And their favorite method for paralyzing this natural philosophical impulse is through so-called historical education, a philosophical system that only recently enjoyed scandalous worldwide fame, found the formula for the self-destruction of philosophy. And now, in any historical consideration of things, we can see so much reckless naivety, proving the unreasonable to be in accord with reason, and calling the blackest of black white, that one is often tempted to quote Hegel's lines as parody. Can what is counted to reason be actual? Alas, today, things practically have to be irrational to be actual. That is to say, have real effects. And using actuality in this sense to explain history is seen as the quiescence of historical education. The philosophical instincts of our youth have puppeted into this, and the particular philosophers of our universities have conspired to reinforce our young scholars' belief in it. Historical, in fact, philological considerations have slowly but surely taken the place of any profound exploration of the eternal problems. The question becomes, what did this or that philosopher think or not think? And is this or that text rightly ascribed to him or not? And even, is this or that variant of a classical text preferable to the other? Students in university philosophy seminaries, Students in university philosophy seminars today are encouraged to occupy themselves with such an emasculated philosophy, whereas for my part, I have long since been accustomed to see such scholarship as a branch of philology and to judge its practitioners according to whether or not they are good philologists. As a result, of course, philosophy itself is banished from the university altogether. With this, our first question about the cultural value of the universities has been answered. As for how the university stands in relation to art, the truth cannot be admitted without shame. The two stand in no relation whatsoever. Not a trace of artistic thinking, learning, striving, or comparative analysis is to be found there. No one can seriously claim that the university lifts its voice to advance important national artistic projects. An individual professor may happen to feel a personal inclination for art, or an endowed chair may be established for aesthetic type literary historians. But that is not the point. The fact remains that the university as a whole does not and cannot impose strict artistic discipline on the young people in its charge. It simply lets whatever happens happen willy-nilly. This is a particularly incisive rebuke to the university's arrogant claim to be the highest educational institution. Our independent academics lead their lives without philosophy, without art. Why then would they want to have anything to do with the Greeks and the Romans, whom no one has to pretend to respect anymore, and who, remote and nearly inaccessible, sit enthroned in majestic strangeness? The universities of today quite logically pay no attention at all to this cultural sense of respect, now utterly extinct. They establish their philological professorships solely to rear up a future generation of exclusively philological minds who will in turn be responsible for the philological preparation of gymnasium students, a life cycle that benefits neither the philologists themselves nor the gymnasiums, but which does serve to belie for a third time in the university's claim to be what is so proudly prosed as a true educational institution. For take away the Greeks, never mind the Romans, along with philosophy and art, and where is the ladder you can use to ascend to a true education? If you try to climb without these aids, then I say all your erudition will weigh heavily on your shoulders instead of giving you wings to bear you aloft. If you are honest and honestly stay with this threefold insight, if you admit that today's students are unprepared for and unsuited to philosophy, lack any artistic instincts, and are mere barbarians with delusions of freedom compared to the Greeks, then you will not flee from these students in disgust, although you might well want to avoid coming too closely in contact with them. For such a student's condition, it's not his fault. The kind of creature you have recognized him to be is merely a silent yet terrible rebuke to those who are truly to blame. You have to understand the secret language of these innocents weighed down with guilt. Only then will you be able to understand the inner nature of the independence they so like to show to the outside world. Not one of these nobly equipped young men has avoided the unresting, exhausting, confusing, deliberating crisis of education. He may seem to be the only free man in the world of bureaucrats and slaves, but he pays for this splendid illusion of freedom with constant and ever-growing doubts and torments. He feels that he cannot guide himself, cannot help himself, and then he dives hopelessly into the world of everyday life and daily routine. He is immersed in the most trivial possible activity, and his limbs grow weak and weary. Suddenly, he pulls himself together, vigorous as ever. He feels the strength that might keep him afloat. Proud and noble resolutions form and grow within him. He is terrified of sinking so soon into the narrow confines of professionalism and grabs at supports and struts so as not to be swept downstream. But for naught, the supports give way. He grasps at the wrong thing, tried to hold fast to fragile reeds. In a low and despondent mood, he sees his plans go up in smoke. His condition is sickening and humiliating. He vacillates between exaggerated, bustling activity and melancholy sluggishness. Tired, lazy, afraid of work, shrinking back from everything great, full of self hatred. He analyzes his own abilities and friends. He analyzes his own ability and finds when he peers into himself only a hollow void or chaotic mess. Then he plummets once more from the heights of imagined self knowledge into ironic skepticism. He sees his struggles as utterly meaningless and declares himself ready for any task, however low and humble, so long as it is real and useful. Now he seeks consolation in frantic, incessant busyness, anything behind which he can hide from himself. And so his perplexity, his lack of a leader to guide him to true education, drives him from one way of life into the other. Doubt, elation, affliction, hope, despair, everything hurls him this way and that, a sign that the stars overhead he could have used to steer his ship have all gone out. And this is how this famous independence, this academic freedom, looks when seen through the fate of the best souls, those with the deepest need for education and culture. Compared to these, the cruder and more easygoing natures who enjoy their freedom in the purely barbaric sense count for nothing. With their low pleasures and premature professional narrowness, they fit perfectly into this so-called freedom. Who would deny it? Their satisfaction, though, does not outweigh the suffering of even a single young man drawn to culture, in need of a guide who at last gets discouraged, lets drop the reins, and begins to despise himself. He is the guiltless innocent, for who weighed him down with the unbearable burden of standing alone? Who urged him to be independent at an age when the desire to devote oneself to a great leader, follow enthusiastically in a master's footsteps, is practically one's most urgent and natural need? It is troubling to think about what happens when this noble need is so violently crushed. Give a close and penetrating look at the most dangerous friends and advocates of today's despicable pseudo-culture, and you will all too often find men who have suffered this degenerate and derailed education, now driven by inner desperation to a furious rage against a culture that no one was willing to show them how to reach. It is not the worst men, not the lowest, whom we meet as journalists later and Feuilletonists after they've undergone the metamorphosis of despair. A certain well-groomed literary type, certain well-groomed literary types nowadays might well be characterized as essentially desperate students. How else can we make sense of the once famous Young Germany movement, whose epigons continue to proliferate today? Here we have a desire for culture that has gone to seed, as it were, finally driven to cry out, I am culture, I am, in such a in such a movement, the culture that has escaped the gymnasiums and universities now hangs around the gates of these institutions with a superior air, but without, of course, any of these institutions' scholarly erudition. The novelist Karl Gutzkov, for instance, can best be understood as the spitting image of the modern, already literary gymnasium schoolboy. It is a serious thing, a man of such degenerate culture, and it is frightening indeed to see that our whole educated reading public bears the mark of this degeneration. When our educated men ceaselessly read journalists and even cooperate in their work of corrupting the people, we have no choice but to suppose that their erudition is functioning for them much as writing novels functions for others. As a flight from themselves, a desperate self-annihilation and ascetic strangulation of their own drive for education and culture, the same sigh gushes forth from our degenerate literature and the senselessly bloated book scribbling of our scholars. How could we so have lost sight of ourselves? But the effort fails. Whole mountains of printed pages are shoveled on, but memory refuses to be stifled. And every so often it repeats the refrain, man of degenerate culture, born to educate and raised in miseducation, helpless barbarian, slave to the present, lying in the chains of the passing moment, and hungering, always eternally hungering. Oh, these miserable innocents who are held to account. There is something they do not have, and every last one of them must have felt the lack of a true educational institution, which could provide them with goals, masters, methods, models, companions, and the invigorating, uplifting breath of a true culture spirit streaming up from within. Instead, these creatures waste away in the wilderness. They degenerate into enemies of the very spirit that is at bottom so like their own. They heap guilt upon guilt more than any generation ever has, sullying what is pure, desecrating what is holy, canonizing what is false and fake. In them, you can see what power our universities have to shape culture. Ask yourself, in all seriousness, what is it that you are promoting with these institutions? German education, German ingenuity, the honest German drive for knowledge, German hard work capable of any sacrifice, splendid and beautiful things, the envy of other nations, the most splendid and beautiful things in the world. In fact, as long as that other true German spirit lies outspread over them like a dark thundercloud, a flash with lightning and bursting with the fruitful benediction of the rain. Instead, you live in fear of that spirit. And thus, it is a heavy and oppressive fog that has gathered around your universities. And in this miasma, your noble young scholars breathe heavily and laboriously, and the best of them perish. Earlier this century, a tragically earnest attempt was made to dispel this fog and open a view onto the distant Empyrean of the German spirit. The episode is uniquely instructive since the history of the universities knows of no similar effort, and there is no clearer example of what we now need to do. I am speaking of the old original Burgenschaft. These young men brought home from the war the most unexpected and worthy trophy of battle. Freedom for the fatherland. Crowned with this laurel, they dreamed of something higher still. Our young men who returned to the university found himself gasping in the oppressive, contaminated air that hung over the places of higher education. Eyes wide with horror, he suddenly saw the universe. He saw the un-German barbarism artfully hidden beneath academic erudition of all kinds. Suddenly, he discovered that his own comrades, lacking a leader, had been abandoned to a noxious youthful frenzy, and he was outraged. He rose up with the same look of proud indignation that Schiller might have had on his face as he recited The Robbers to his companions. Schiller published his play with an image of a lion and the motto, In Tyrannos. But this young man, now returning to the university, was himself that lion, preparing to spring, and every tyrant truly did tremble. Yes, to timid and superfluous observers, these outraged youths seemed not so different from Schiller's robbers. To anxious listeners, the youth's speech made Rome and Sparta seem mere nunneries in comparison. The shock and fear these outraged young men inspired was more widespread than anything the robbers ever caused in court circles. Although, as Guth reports, one German prince did apparently remark that if he were God and had foreseen these robbers, he would never have created the world. What gave rise to the senseless intensity of this terror? These outraged young men were the bravest, most talented, and purest-hearted men in their generation, distinguished in dress and deportment, but a blithely magnanimous spirit and a noble simplicity of morals. Magnificent vows bound them together in the service of strict and pious discipline. What was there to be afraid of? It will never be known to what extent those who feared these youths were fooling themselves or fooling others or recognizing the truth. But a strong instinct was at work. In this fear and in the disgraceful, senseless persecution that followed, the Burgenschaft was instinctively hated with burning hatred for two reasons. Because its organization presented the first attempt to create a true educational institution, and because this institution spirit was the manly, serious, somber, hardy, bold German spirit, the spirit of Luther, the miner's son, preserved unbroken from the time of the Reformation. Now keep in mind the fate of the Burgenschaft when I ask you, did the German universities of the time understand that spirit? The way even the German princes in their hatred apparently understood it. Did the university courageously throw her arms around her noblest prodigy, shouting, "To kill them, you will have to kill me first. I can hear you. And you must judge by that answer whether or not the German university is a true educational institution." The Burgenschaft student of that time sensed how deeply an educational institution needs to take roots, all the way down in the inner renewal and inspiration of the purest moral capacities. And let this be retold always to his credit. Perhaps he learned on the battlefield what he was hardly likely to learn to today's realm of academic freedom. That we need great leaders and that all education begins with obedience. So amid the jubilation of victory, he thought of his liberated fatherland and vowed to remain German. German now, at last he understood Tacitus. Now he grasped Kant's categorical imperative. Now he was ravished by the songs of Karl Maria von Weber, von Weber's Lyre and the Sword. The gates of philosophy, of art, and even of antiquity sprang up open before him. And in one of the most memorable bloody deeds of our history, the murder of Kotzebue, deep instincts and short-sighted enthusiasm led him to avenge his one and only Schiller, ground down all too soon by the resistance of the obtuse world. Schiller, who could have been his leader, master, and organizer, and whose loss he now lamented with such heartfelt fury. Such, true to their forebodings, was the students' undoing. They never found the leader they needed. Gradually, they came to doubt each other and grew dissatisfied and disunited all too quickly. Unhappy missteps revealed the lack of a dauntless genius in their midst. They were leaderless, and it destroyed them. For I repeat, my friends, all education begins with the exact opposite of what everyone praises so highly today as academic freedom. It begins with obedience, subordination, discipline, servitude. And just as great leaders need followers, so too must the lead have a leader. Must the led have a leader. A certain reciprocal predisposition prevails in the hierarchy of the spirit. Yes, a kind of pre-established harmony, the eternal hierarchy that all things naturally gravitate toward, is just what the so-called culture, now sitting on the throne of the present, aims to overturn and destroy. This culture wants to bring leaders down to the level of its compulsory servitude, or kill themselves off altogether, or kill them off altogether. It always foreordained followers searching high and low for one who is to lead them. While its intoxications deeded even their instinct to seek. While their intoxications deaden even their instinct to seek. If, though, wounded and battle-weary, the two sides destined for each other find a way to come together at last, the result is a deep, thrilling bliss that resounds like the strings of an eternal lyre. Only with the aid of a metaphor can I convey something of this feeling. Have you ever been to a concert rehearsal and really looked at the strange, shriveled, good-natured subspecies of humanity that typically makes up a German orchestra? What flights of fancy on the part of that capricious goddess form? What noises and ears? What clumsy movements and skeletal clattering? Imagine for a moment that you were deaf and had never dreamed of the existence of music and melodies, and that you were asked to appreciate an orchestra's movements as a purely physical performance. Untroubled by the idealizing effects of the music, you would never be able to get enough of the sight of this comedy. Crude like a medieval woodcut, this innocent caricature of Homo sapiens. Now imagine your hearing has returned, your ears have opened, and up in front of the orchestra, a worthy conductor is performing his assigned task. The comedy of the arrangement is gone. You hear, but know, what our worthy conductor seems to communicate to his fellow musicians is the spirit of boredom. You see nothing but flabby effeminacy, hear nothing but rhythmic inaccuracies, melodic mediocrity, emotional triviality. For you, the orchestra has become a mere crowd, mildly annoying, if not downright distasteful. Now, however, let your imagination soar and put a genius, a real genius, in the midst of this mass. You perceive an immediate, incredible transformation. It is as if by a kind of instantaneous transmigration of the soul. He has entered into all of these half bestial bodies, so that these all gaze out with a single demonic eye. Look and listen now. You will never see or hear your fill. When you regard the orchestra now in its sublime tempest or heartfelt laments, when you sense the agile tension of every muscle and the rhythmic necessity of their every movement, then you too will feel what constitutes a pre-established harmony between leader and led, and how in the hierarchy of spirits, everything pushes towards this kind of organization. From this simile of mine, you can guess what I understand a true educational institution to be, and why I cannot in any way see the university as such a place. That is the end of lecture 5 from Friedrich Nietzsche. And I believe the sixth lecture, at least, is not translated in here. I do not exactly know what happened to it. I've heard it was unfinished. In my German edition, there is somewhat of a sixth lecture, and I have yet to figure out if I can find a translation or somehow work my way through lecture 6 in the future. But for right now, that is the end of lecture 5. And thank you, everyone, for listening.